parents, let's talk about marriage. Are marriages more impacted for families who have children with unique needs? Well, we are going to talk about that today in another episode of Thriving Special Families. I'm your host, Crystal Sanford from Sanford Autism Consulting, and we are here to offer you insight, humor, and hope along your parenting journey. Our topic today is help and hope for marriages, and we have our very esteemed guest for a second time, Dr. Mike Barnes. Good morning, Dr. Barnes.
Good morning, Crystal. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's a pleasure. You were just such a great resource for us and your previous episode, parents. If you're a part of our podcast, please make sure to check out Dr. Barnes's episode. We talked a lot about trauma and how trauma impacts parenting and how trauma relates to us who are parenting children with unique needs. And so I just knew I had to have you back again to talk about marriage, because that's another area that I believe needs some support for our families.
Sure. It's a huge issue.
Great. Well, families, again, we are here at Thriving Special Families. If you're listening to the podcast, then welcome. If you're watching us live, feel free to add your comments or questions to the comment section, and we'll do our best to answer those along the way. And then lastly, if you are in need of medical or legal advice, please do contact your professional in that area, as our information that is shared is for your informational purposes only. So again, Dr. Barnes, such a really valued member of the community. Dr. Barnes is a master addiction counselor. He's a licensed addiction counselor and a licensed professional counselor, a diplomat in the American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress. Dr. Barnes serves as the Chief Clinical Officer at Foundry Treatment Center in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And Dr. Barnes comes to the Foundry after serving for 5 years as the clinical manager of residential services at Cedar at the University of Colorado Hospital and 10 years as a full-time clinical professor in counseling. And so Dr. Barnes just has a wealth of experience to share from. I'd love to hear just a little bit more, especially for our audience members who aren't familiar with your background. What led you to become a psychologist and become experienced in the area of trauma?
Well, actually, my Ph.D. is in marriage and family therapy. And that, so I grew up in a family that had an alcoholic grandfather and a significant amount of trauma. That at the time, who knew? We didn't talk about trauma in those days. That wasn't really an issue. But when I got to college and I took my first psychology course, everything just sort of came together for me. And I started to understand how family systems operate and the impact of illness and psychiatric illness and, chronic disease impacts how families operate. So I became really fascinated with becoming a marriage and family therapist. And so my last, while I was in my doctoral program, our son was hit by a car and spent 3 weeks in intensive care and 3 weeks in the hospital and then 6 months in rehab and all of the other things. And he's 35 and he's fine today. But we were one of those families who really didn't make it after that event, and it was really painful and difficult. And so I've really become a student of chronic disease or chronic illness of any kind.
Wow, and thank you. We appreciate you and your vulnerability and sharing about your own experience. Often experience does lead us to want to delve more and become kind of fellow travelers, but experts in certain areas. So I believe that that's been the same for you. How have you seen trauma impact marriages in your practice and in your experience?
Well, I have to tell you, it's in every way, shape, and form. Like it's the lens that I see today when I see families that are struggling is not, who's, like looking at the parts of the relationship as much as what happened to this relationship, what happened that became a challenge or challenged their resilience. And I often say that when a chronic disease or chronic illness or condition happens, that the coping mechanisms or the solutions that families originally pick often become the new problems, because
Uh-huh.
they don't get to us for the real problem. They get to us with these sort of peripheral problems that when we begin to look, we can see that the impact of a diagnosis, the impact of behaviors of a child, the impacts of disagreement between parents on what's the best method to handle this and how should we behave going forward, um, is really what most families are wrestling with.
Wow, that's really huge, and something to consider, that not necessarily the incident or the diagnosis as much as how each person is choosing to respond to that, and what coping strategies they're using. That appears to be the area of difficulty.
Yes.
Mm, wow. So parents, and we are, many of us are autism parents. I myself am parenting a child with autism. She's 10, and with a diagnosis since 3.5. So there is a space for, many marriages to, maybe they found out early on, and then just parenting in itself is a struggle. But again, as unique things happen to your child, that can become more of a struggle. So um, after several years, you begin to see, maybe not a breakdown, but maybe a misfocus of attention. I don't know. I mean, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you've seen as parents are married for several years after the incident. Oh, I can't hear you. Let's see. Is your volume down? There you go. I can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry about that. So it can be a number of things. It could be right away a disagreement that creates conflict, trust issues, but most often with this kind of an issue, it's more of a fading away, and that as each person finds their own way of coping, and again, no two people cope with circumstances like this alike. And the chronic disease researchers would tell us that it begins with our family of origin and three-generation assessment of how have our predecessors, our ancestors, handled things like chronic disease, addiction, those kinds of things. Or if there were medical conditions in those families of origin, how are they to be handled? How does getting help, and how does the kind of distribution of tasks within the family, what's the right way and the wrong way to do that? And so oftentimes as families struggle to come to a unified method of coping, and that's not working, they will slowly start to fade away.
Wow. So, I mean, you're saying a lot of it is what we're bringing to the table just from our family history, on top of, our own maybe ideas and what we've learned. Is there a space to change that cycle? Let's say, you came from a home where, trauma, or maybe let's say mental health needs weren't even discussed. How do you make that shift? Is it possible to make that shift, bringing that to the table?
Yeah, it's interesting. I will often say that, and it's on my website, that family healing starts with difficult conversations. And the idea that everyone, typically, when these issues are new, are really trying to support one another and try to do the best they can. We call it morphogenic change, the idea that in crisis, we begin to act in the best way possible to ease that crisis. And then over the course of time, if that doesn't go away, if it becomes a chronic illness or a chronic condition of some kind, then we have to create new ways of coping and new ways of communicating, what we call the 5 R's: new rules and roles and routines, boundaries and things like that, that can make living with a chronic illness far more, I hate to say easy because that's not the right word, but functional is probably not the right word either. I'm not finding the right word, but successful.
There is a space to develop new rules, new patterns, even if you're bringing that to the table, even if that's what you saw modeled, there is a space to make some shifts there, so that there is health and growth in your marriage. So that's really good to consider. And parents, if you're just joining us, we're here with another episode of Thriving Special Families. We have Dr. Barnes, and our topic today is help and hope for marriages. And we're just diving into what happens when a marriage is impacted by a diagnosis for a child. Autism is one of the ones that we discuss and is near and dear to my heart, but as well as any other unique needs that are found with a child, or even accidents or things that occur. How does that impact the marriage, and what can we do to bring hope and health and healing? And so Dr. Barnes is sharing that, a lot of it is what you're bringing to the table from your history, from your family history, but there is a space to make change there. And it's really not as much about the incident as much as it is about your response to that, and how you can bring two different people together to kind of somehow as one have a unified response, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are several really important scholars in the world of family chronic disease management. I like a person by the name of John Rowland from Chicago. And he really talks about how viewing the chronic illness as something that the individual has really divides families. And that the important part is that families begin to look far more at ourselves as a system, that while one member has the biological components of the illness, we are all dealing with it equally in our own ways. And so he talks about families seeing themselves as a system rather than a group of individuals necessarily. Understanding problems from a we perspective, as a he or she perspective, and really beginning to understand the illness and how the family, we're not programmed to know how to deal with these things. This is new to us, so we do the best we can. So understanding, I talked about the rules and how those change, and what happens to the other kids, and how do we maintain care for them. And we may see acting out behavior on the other siblings that might need some attention as well, or more needy other children. So, or anxious, or, depressed other kids. So beginning to recognize it not as like the illness is in the middle and impacting each person, but how it's recursive. That it's not only impacting each person, but then each person is impacting every other person in a way that is, we have to. And I think about, there's a very old model of family resilience by Charles Figley back in the 89, I think was, but he talks about the exact same thing, that resilient families lose the us or they, he or, us against, not against, but with the person with the illness, that resilient families are very open to the fact that we all have been impacted by that.
Wow, that's really powerful. That's something that I talk about with families as we support them in the education process, is that idea of it's not us against them. So sometimes parents will come to me looking for support because they feel as though the school has done this to their child, or the school has, it's their fault. And that's one of the first things I talk about is we've got to change our perspective. It's not us against them. We're collaborative partners. What can we do together to best support your child? And so it sounds like the same thing is true in resilient families. It's not this disease, this comment or whatever to disrupt our home. It's, okay, this is what's happening. How can we together work together to still be a happy and healthy family?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's really important is we tend to get really focused on problems, like the things that we have to solve. And there's an old quantum physics saying that says, where you put your attention is where you put your energy, and where you put your energy is what you create. And so if our focus is going on to what is wrong and who's at fault and some of these factors that take us away from how to support one another through the process of solution-oriented thinking, and that it's, as long as it gets fixed, it's good. Not necessarily all this energy that goes to all of these other like fear-based things. And trust me, as a parent with a kid in a body cast, I understand fear-based things.
Oh yeah, I can totally imagine. It's got to be extremely difficult to be able to see your kid. A lot of what we deal with is not, it doesn't have as much of a physical manifestation, but not that it, makes it any less of a challenge, but to see your kid physically impaired, it's got to be tough. But again, I love that. So we're looking from a solution-based perspective. And parents, if you're listening and picking up anything, that's really important to think about. A solution-based perspective and not being driven by the fear, because that's not going to keep you in a good space. I think we even talked about it earlier, that fight or flight space of living. Sometimes parents live there, and we're not supposed to live there.
And if I could just add to that a little bit, the idea that we have to understand that if we're in fight or flight, our body is in control, not our brain. And our brain is just simply trying to figure out the fastest way to get out of harm's way. And if we're in solution-oriented focus, we're going to really have a hard time to identify solutions, because we're not dealing with the full faculties of our prefrontal cortex and the part of our brain that is the problem-solving, thinking, rational, decision-making, coping part of our brain. And so that idea of trying to be as calm as possible, using mindfulness skills, using meditation, using exercise, whatever coping strategies we need to use to keep that fight or flight response at its lowest case possible, so that we can really figure out what the best solutions are, and we can support one another rather than defend in that fearful place.
And I can imagine if both parents are coming from that space, then that's where you can see marriages continue to stay successful, continue to stay healthy, if both parents are taking that on. What happens, Dr. Barnes, when maybe one parent is kind of walking in this perspective, but the other has remained in fight or flight? I mean, that's got to be super difficult.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon at all. It's a very common scenario. And I think that's where those really hard conversations come, and the idea of being really clear about how that's not just impacting the child that everyone is focusing on helping, but how it's impacting the relationship, and it's impacting other children if they're there. And so often it's that one parent becomes very hypervigilant and very controlling of the care and the medical concerns and schools, and the other person is trying to keep all the other balls in the air that are families and relationships. And those are sort of formulas for huge marital conflict in the not too distant future. And so the idea of offering to, let's go talk to someone together. Let's go talk to someone for the whole family, bring the other kids as well. And what's it been like for them? And the idea of worst case scenario is that this family does not survive to be there to support the child that we're so focused on supporting. And that if it's all about the child, then it's not about the family.
Yeah.
So that's the shift that has to happen. And so often people don't want to hurt the other person, or they can see the fragile nature of that other person. And so they begin to live those sort of parallel lives. And that's, again, the sort of formula for a future disaster.
And I can imagine, there's, people who are saying, well, that's how I'm dealing with it, right? It's just letting them be in the space that they need to be in, and I can only control myself.
Mhm.
You're saying that's not going to take you very far. There just needs to be those difficult conversations because we're a unit. And just like if you're, playing sports, like if one person is going rogue, that's not going to help the team win.
And it's just to be as clear as can possibly be. That parent who is the hypervigilant and controlling is dealing with a trauma response. That's what we do.
Yes.
And so remember, it's not the event that is the trauma. It's how our brains and our bodies and our nervous systems and our belief systems are impacted by that event in order to maintain as much safety as possible. And so we become intolerant and impatient with each other sometimes because we need them to see things the way we see them so we can feel safe. And that's where most families begin to grow apart.
Mm.
Or a parent will say, I need you to support me with this school that's not doing what they're doing, what they need to do, when one parent may think that they actually are. It's just that the condition of the child is actually problematic, and that maybe we need a different solution than the one we're going after. But they're not saying it because it would be, a huge issue. And so there's a disproportionate amount of energy from each partner going into solving it that certain way. And again, that's where being able to have a conversation that says, how do we work together rather than apart? And oftentimes the child will connect to that one parent that's always available, and be more distant from the other parent.
And that's got to be hard too. And I know that can happen. Often it's the mom, right, who, even if they're not available, they make a space to be available. And maybe the mom, the dad, okay, if it's the situation, is, working hard and doing the best they can, and maybe even throws himself more into the work because he just doesn't know how to handle it. How do parents navigate that?
Well, we kind of call that the fadeaway father rule, where, I was talking to a father once. When I asked why he did that, he says, well, my status is much higher at work than it is at home.
Oh man, we don't want that. But I'm sure this was his interpretation.
Yeah, that there's things had become so contentious at home, and that any comment was kind of viewed by both parties as being an attack of some kind. And so, the idea of going to talk with someone, sometimes it's hard to solve those on your own. Having a third person who understands the trauma response, who understands illness, who will tell you, yeah, this is kind of normal. This happens a lot. That you're both doing the best you can do, and let's talk about what would you like it to look like. And that's, again, as that fight or flight response is happening, our brains are offline trying to get us out of harm's way, rather than being willing to sit in that kind of scary place of like really vulnerable conversation.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And again, this is just tying into a lot of the work that we do as advocates. It's that we are asking parents those questions. What is it that you want as a remedy? What is it long term that you're looking for? And help, but that forces you to have to, like you said, sit with the issue and really think about it. And sometimes we don't want to do that, but we need that. I think if we can have that perspective of what we're looking for as a long term goal, then from there we can kind of see, well, what is it going to take to get there?
Yeah, when I work with those families, my first question is always the same, and it's, how do you both feel independently about being asked to come here and have a discussion that is so raw and vulnerable for you to start with. And I want couples to know that I don't take, and all therapists will have a very similar view, that idea of that you can't, this isn't a little issue. This is a very big, scary, and painful issue. And for both to be able to talk about not just how they're feeling, but the circumstances with their relationship with this person that was the love of their life, that's gone. This child that was going to be this wonderful, piece of the family, and but is struggling, and that opens the door to a conversation that isn't about blaming, but is about feeling and experiencing. And then you can begin from there.
That's great. Parents, again, if you're listening, we're talking about help and hope for marriages. Dr. Barnes is giving some really great insight, as well as tips for what can be done to see progress. And one of those things is having some difficult conversations, opening that door to talking about the elephant in the room. If it's the autism diagnosis, if it's the child struggling at school, if it's the injury that's occurred, and how we're both responding to that, I think is what Dr. Barnes is saying, that sometimes it's going to take those uncomfortable, difficult conversations. But if you can get past that space, you may see that it really opens the door to some great progress and success in your marriage. And then another side of it is if the problem has gotten really big, potentially you may need to bring in another party who can help you and be that unbiased third party to help you navigate the waters of success in your marriage. Dr. Barnes, do you have any other feedback or tips for parents as we're ending our time together today?
I think that, again, that idea of family history. And if I grew up in a family where, we didn't talk about problems, or we didn't talk about our feelings, that we didn't, trust, like, at that level, that's going to carry over into these other kinds of issues. So that willingness to say, I love you and I need you to be a partner in this. And if I need to look at my side, but we need to be together on this, and at all costs, and that level of vulnerability. So that's that difficult conversation that I'm talking about.
Wow. And I like that too, that, I love you and I want to be together with you in this situation. I think sometimes we lose that whole, like, I love you. We connected for a reason. We are here together, unified. And I think that a piece of kind of helping issues like this is not forgetting that space, like, like date night. Like my husband and I try to do everything we can to have some semblance of date night, even if it's once a month, to kind of keep the embers burning, like remembering like who we are as a couple beyond just being parents. I think maybe if I'm not a therapist, but if I had a tip to give, that would be one of them, is if you can keep that going, that might help as these other situations are occurring.
I think that's exactly right. And anything that the couple can do to kind of be life-giving to one another, as opposed to like sort of taking that idea of I'm going to take my energy because I need it and go kind of in my own orbit, but the idea of how do we facilitate an ongoing energy or symbiotic or kind of process of like co-generation of emotion by maintaining the love in our relationship, the time that we spend together. So I think you're right on with that, like date nights and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, something that just reminds you of you together. Like you said, I love that, putting energy that brings you together, that feeds the marriage, versus taking your energy and doing other things with it. I think that can be really kind of a proactive strategy.
Yeah, so much of the energy goes towards the child, and that takes energy away from the most important, which is the family. And I know people will say, you don't understand, like this child needs all this energy, and they do.
Mhm.
But there has to be a way to maintain the love and support within the family so that no one person has to be that person who gives that energy.
Oh boy, that's great. That's just a nice way to end our time together as we've been discussing help and hope for marriages. Again, families, we've had Dr. Barnes here sharing from his insight, his even personal experience, and years of supporting families. Dr. Barnes has just shared so many great nuggets. Again, we're just so happy to have had you here sharing with us again, Dr. Barnes.
My pleasure. Anytime.
So, families, if you are in need of more support in this area, I believe that Dr. Barnes may be able to direct you in that way. Dr. Barnes, do you want to share your information?
Yeah, my email address is mike.barnes, Barnes, at Foundry, you can see it, Foundry, steamboat.com. And you can send me an email. I also have a website that you might be interested in, drmikebarnes.com, that has some videos and some other information that you can leave a message on there as well, and I will get it. So yeah, I would love to hear from you, and if I can be of any help, let me know.
That's so great, families. Take advantage of that. If you are a family who maybe you're not in crisis, maybe you are, maybe you're trying to avoid being in crisis in your marriage, Dr. Barnes has just some wonderful tips and resources and can be a really valuable resource. So again, thank you again for listening and watching to another episode of Thriving Special Families. Always know that parents, you're going to be okay, and your child is going to be okay too. Have a great one. Bye-bye.